Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this webinar today, where we will be discussing a very important topic. I'm your host, Yolian Ogbu. I'll be able to moderate this really amazing panel with great speakers. We are discussing imperialism, particularly in Sudan and Libya, and specifically the implications for the African continent and the diaspora at large. So once again, my name is Yolian, and I am an Eritrean organizer and graduate student that have been involved in BAP-related programs before, so I'm excited to be here today. I'm also excited that we are hosting this webinar today, which is African Liberation Day. African Liberation Day was founded in 1958 when Kwame Nkrumah convened the first conference of independent states held in Accra, Ghana, and attended by 8 independent African states. On the 25th of May, 1963, 31 African heads of state convened a summit meeting to found the Organization of African Unity, OAU. They renamed it to African Freedom Day. They renamed African Freedom Day to African Liberation Day and changed its date to May 25th. And the organization today that is hosting this webinar is the Black Alliance for Peace. The Black Alliance for Peace is an alliance that seeks to recapture and redevelop this historic anti-war, anti-imperialist, and pro-peace positions of the radical Black movement. Through educational activities, organizing, and movement support, organizations and individuals in this alliance are continuing to work to oppose both militarized domestic state repression and the policies of destabilization, subversion, and the permanent war agenda of the US state globally. We also have a US out of Africa / shutdown AFRICOM campaign. So what BAP was created is this US out of Africa network that serves as the organizing arm of the US out of Africa or shutdown AFRICOM campaign. We are demanding the right to sovereignty and self-determination for African people by closing of all US NATO military bases in Africa. So I'm excited to get into these speakers and really listen to their commentary and what they have to say on this particular topic. You will all get an opportunity to ask questions at the Q&A towards the end of the webinar today. If you do have any questions as we continue throughout this webinar, please go to the Q&A box to the left, bottom left, next to share screen and participants. I will be, our team will be monitoring the questions in here, so we'll make sure to answer as much as possible. So let's get into the first speaker. Mr. Abayomi Azikiwe is the editor of Pan-African Newswire, an electronic press agency that was founded in 1998. He has worked for decades in solidarity with the liberation movements and progressive governments on the African continent and the Caribbean. He is the host of a weekly blog talk radio program entitled the Pan-African Journal Worldwide Radio Broadcast. So happy to have you here, Abayomi.
Thank you so much, Yolian, for that very generous introduction. I also want to thank the hosts, the Black Alliance for Peace, for putting on this very important webinar. This is the 60th anniversary of the formation of the Organization of African Unity, and I wanted to extend my revolutionary greetings to all African people on the continent and in the diaspora, as well as the international community in general. May 25th represents the 60th anniversary of the founding of the Organization of African Unity, the OAU. It was created, as mentioned earlier, by more than 30 independent states in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in 1963. Nearly 4 decades later, in 2002, the African Union came into existence with a stated renewed commitment to greater unity and coordinated development on the continent and throughout the diaspora. The events in Ethiopia during May of 1963 represented a watershed in the struggle for national liberation and Pan-Africanism, which can be traced back centuries to the heroic resistance against enslavement and colonization. A series of Pan-African conferences and congresses took place between 1893 and 1945, which brought together African nations from various geopolitical regions of the globe to discuss their common interests, aimed at chartering a methodology to win freedom and social justice for the masses of the people. Since 1963, many more colonies have gained their independence, while the economic and military liberation of the continent remains elusive. Today, the United States Africa Command, AFRICOM, along with French and other North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO troops, are operating in numerous states throughout the region. As a direct result of this renewed militarization of the continent by the imperialist centers of global power, there has been deepening levels of instability and displacement. Africans are being human trafficked across North Africa and the Mediterranean in a manner which is reminiscent of the Atlantic slave trade, which took place between the 15th and the 19th centuries. The increasing presence of peoples of African descent in the nations of Europe and in North America has provided an ideological rationale for the emergence of neo-fascist organizations and political officials. On the southern border of the United States, 1,500 troops, along with the thousands of law enforcement personnel and vigilantes, are patrolling to keep people of color out of this country. Despite these harsh realities, there have been awakenings throughout the world in which Africans are very much involved. Although there is the reemergence of military coups in several West African states, the mass sentiment from the workers, farmers, and youth is decisively anti-imperialist. The rising consciousness is reflected in many of the foreign policy positions articulated by African heads of state and envoys in their speeches annually before the United Nations General Assembly. This same outlook permeated the anti-imperialist governments that were in existence at the time of the founding of the OAU. Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, the then president of the First Republic of Ghana, exemplified the concept of positive action, which was employed in the independence struggles which he led in the former British colonial Gold Coast from 1947 to 1957. This is just to give you some background information to place this date, this anniversary, within an historical context. I just want to quote from Dr. Kwame Nkrumah from his book entitled Africa Must Unite, which was released in May of 1963 at the founding of the Organization of African Unity. And Nkrumah said in that seminal work, and I quote, "For freedom is not a commodity which is given to the enslaved upon demand. It is a precious reward, the shining trophy of struggle and sacrifice. Nor do the struggle and sacrifice cease with the attainment of freedom. The period of servitude leaves behind tolls beyond what it has already taken. These are the costs of filing in the emptiness that colonialism has left. The struggle and the toil to build the foundation and then the superstructure of an economy will raise up the social levels of our people. that will provide them with a full and satisfying life from which want and stagnation will have been banished. We have to guard closely our hard-won freedom and keep it safe from the predatory designs of those who wish to reimpose their will upon us, unquote. Now, these words that were written 60 years ago in 1963 are quite prophetic. The struggle against neocolonialism, which Nkrumah called the last stage of imperialism, which was the title of a study that he released 2 years after the founding of the OAU. He talks about the purported, quote, departure, unquote, of the colonial powers. It was these same colonial powers, for example, in the former Belgian Congo, who were instrumental in thwarting the efforts of the first democratically elected prime minister of that country, Patrice Lumumba, during mid-1960 and early 1961. The collective imperialism led by Washington and Wall Street were identified by Nkrumah in 1965 as the principal enemies of the African Revolution. Despite the US attempts to distance itself historically from the rise of colonialism in Africa, their ruling interests were also present at the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885, where the continent was carved up among the leading imperialist centers of the time. Even prior to the establishment of independence for the 13 British colonies and what later became the United States, native removal and African enslavement were thoroughly entrenched into the political economy. Now, the subject which I want to touch on of this webinar deals with the implications of the destabilization of the Republic of Sudan and also the state of Libya. Sudan has been in the international media since the eruption of clashes between the two military structures in charge of the administration of a transitional state. Now, this happened beginning on April the 15th. The Sudanese armed forces have long held a position of authority within various governments since the independence from British imperialism in 1956. There have been extended periods in the post-colonial political history of Sudan where the military seized control of the government while ruling interests of the imperialist states and their allies backed many of these extrajudicial and illegal seizure of powers by military forces in the Republic of Sudan. Today, the Rapid Support Forces, which grew out of the campaign to suppress the rebellion in the Darfur region in the western part of Sudan, has been pitted against the Sudanese armed forces. Since the beginning of this conflict on April 15th, it has been reported that anywhere between 700 and 1,000 people have been killed in the Republic of Sudan. Over 5,000, according to relief agencies and other sources, have been wounded or injured. In regard to displacement, we're looking at the displacement of over 1 million people in Sudan, 200,000 or more of which have already crossed the borders into neighboring countries such as the Republic of South Sudan, Chad, as well as Egypt. Now, this, of course, has created conditions for the further militarization by the United States and other imperialist countries in the Horn of Africa. The United States has sent 2 naval vessels to the port of Sudan in the east of the country, ostensibly to facilitate evacuations, but they're also utilizing drones and other military equipment to monitor the situation in the Republic of Sudan. Of course, the role of the United States, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Egypt has been pivotal in developing this crisis which exists today in Sudan. In regard to Libya, since 12 years ago, the United States launched its first full-scale operation for the U.S. Africa Command. In 2011, utilizing two United Nations Security Council resolutions, 1970 and Resolution 1973, this provided a legal rationale for the blanket bombing of Libya, the killing of tens of thousands of people, the displacement of hundreds of thousands of more, the assassination of the former leader, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, who headed the Jamaharia political system in Libya. What has happened in Libya over the last 12 years? There has been the systematic destruction of civil society, of the national infrastructure, and Libya has become a focal point for human trafficking and for the destabilization of other countries in North and West Africa. In concluding this presentation, I just wanted to mention that these regime changes and direct occupations have not brought any relief, let alone prosperity, to the working classes of Western Europe, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Since the economic conditions have worsened due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the supply chain shortages in industry and commerce, along with an inflationary spiral, which has skyrocketed since the early months of 2020. Consequently, the central banks of the capitalist states have raised interest rates, they've tightened credit availability, they have prompted layoffs in the high-tech, real estate, and service industries within all the capitalist countries worldwide. The Biden administration has not come to grips with the drastic changes within the labor market since 2020. And rather than impose price controls on the capitalist corporations, Biden has concentrated on the war in Ukraine, which has drained the national treasury of at least $115 billion here in the United States. Now, of course, I just wanted to conclude with another quote from Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. He mentions in his book, Class Struggle in Africa, that the African Revolution, while still concentrating its main effort on the destruction of imperialism, colonialism, and neocolonialism, it is aiming at the same time to bring about a radical transformation of society. It is no longer a question of whether African independent states should pursue a capitalist or non-capitalist path of development. The choice has already been made by the workers and peasants of Africa. They have chosen liberation and unification, and this can only be achieved through armed struggle under socialist direction. For the political unification of Africa and socialism are synonymous. One cannot be achieved without the other, unquote. These same axioms that were enunciated in 1970 still holds true for the African diaspora today as well. In the United States and Western Europe, the intensification of racist repression and super exploitation serves to further institutionalize the national oppression of peoples of color. Mass demonstrations and urban rebellions, which resurfaced in the aftermath of the police execution of George Floyd, which also occurred on African Liberation Day just 3 years ago in 2020, illustrates the potential for revolutionary change in the very citadel of imperialism. In conclusion, I would like to say, however, it will take the mass mobilization and organization of the most oppressed elements within capitalist society to reach the desired abolition of exploitation and oppression. Undoubtedly, based upon the history of African peoples over their previous 6 decades, they will play a pivotal role in the elimination of imperialism as a whole in the modern world. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mr. Abayomi. And please continue to add questions if you have any so far and throughout the rest of this webinar, again, in the Q&A box, the bottom center left of your screen. Next, we have Dr. Abdiwahab Abdisamad. He's a Somali Kenyan and Kenyan citizen. He is the executive director of the Institute for the Horn of Africa Studies and a specialist in political science, conflict resolution, and rural development. Thank you so much, Dr. Abdiwahab. Oh, if you could please unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. Let me start and give you a brief history of African society. For instance, today we are celebrating 60 years of African, independence, the formation of African unity. 60 years down the line, where are we now? Let me take you back to the history. The African interference was started with slavery during slavery time. Then when slavery lost its own value, they graduated into the Berlin Conference of November 1884 up to February 1885. Then early 1960s, our forefathers, Kwame Nkrumah, Jamal Abdel Nasser, Ahmed Sekature, and you mentioned it, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, they formed and established African, Organization of African Unity. The aim of Organization of African Unity was, to rebuild an African countries and to remove the artificial boundaries between the African states. Unfortunately, Western leaders of Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, as well as Liberia, they undermine the concept of Pan-Africanism. That's why it has taken us 60 years to form the continent, one continent, one voice. Africa has a 1.27 billion, people. Africa is a rich continent compared to Europe, compared to Asia, compared to any other continent in the world. It's a very rich, continent. Fortunately, when the Africa gained independence in early 1960s, the Francophone, countries in Africa, which consist of almost 14 countries, when they're gaining independence from France, the French colony, they force into the newly independent African states. Either they are going to affiliate with France or they want to be independent state from France. Out of 14 countries of Francophone, only 2 choose to be independent. That's Burkina Faso and Mali. What has done France at that time? He dismantled the infrastructure of both Burkina Faso and Mali and looted everything of those 2 countries. Unfortunately, again, those who signed the pact with France, those who signed the agreement with France, they forced him to deposit their own reserve, 85% of their own reserve into Central Bank of France, which means they cannot even access their own money. Still, Africa is a new colony. It's kind of, in fact, it's still an occupation of the France. Apart from that, the Lusophone, the Anglo-Saxons, they are not better. Still, we are the colony. We are not free. 60 years down the line, we are not free. They infiltrated our own system. They infiltrated our banks. They infiltrated our system of education. They infiltrated our system of economy. They infiltrated what you call every sector of our society. They have military camps in everywhere. They, in fact, even the African Development Bank, if you look at the African Development Bank, 60% of the shares owned to Western world. Only 25% owned by the Africans. They interfere through the military, through the NGO, through the education system, through every sector of our society, they interfere. 60 years down the line, still we are not feeling we are fully independent states, unfortunately. You see Africa-US summit. You see Africa-Japan summit. You see Africa-Russian summit. You see Africa-Chinese summit. So are we really, we ask ourselves, are we really an independent state? 60 years down the line. That exactly, if you look at the trade within the European country, it's almost 60%. The trade within Latin America, 48%. The trade between the Asians is almost 55%. But unfortunately, the trade within African society is only 15%. It still is a long way to go. It's still a long way to go. When I put aside that brief history of African continent, let me address the issue of the Sudan. Sudan is the first sub-Saharan Africa who gained independence from Britain in 1956, followed by the Ghana. If you look at Ghana, the gross domestic product of Ghana of 1957, it was at 350 per person per year. Compared to the South Korea, the same year from Japan, 60 years down the line, where is the South Korea? And where is Ghana? And you cannot compare the natural resources of Ghana to South Korea. Ghana is a rich country in terms of resources. It's a rich country in terms of minerals. But you cannot compare to what you call the natural resources of the South Korea. The continents are very rich. African states are very rich. But also, we don't have a good managers. We don't have a good managers. In other words, we don't have a good leaders. We have a leadership crisis. Unless we change the mindset of African society, unless we change the mindset of African leaders, Africa is far from being a developed states, because unfortunately, most of our leaders are thieves. They are just looting the country right, left, and center, unfortunately. Let me come back now the issue of Sudan crisis. 30 years ago, 1989, Omar Hassan al-Bashir came to power. Then, for the last 30 years, 95% of the military, of the army forces, Sudanese army forces, are Muslim Brotherhood. And again, the rapid response forces of the Mohammed Dagalo Hamiti, it was a creation of what you call the military regime of Sudan at that time to suppress the Darfur people, Darfur region of the Sudan. Unfortunately, later on, they became a proxy forces for the Arab states, specifically United Arab Emirates. They trained more than 150,000 of the mercenaries. Half of the army, they came from neighboring states, specifically from Chad, Libya, and Ethiopia, and elsewhere. 50% of the members of the Rapid Response Forces of Habiti or Muhammad Dagalo, they are mercenaries who came from neighboring states. They have done a dirty work in Yemen civil war. They became a gun for hires. Those Arab states, the Gulf states, they hire those mercenaries, and they have done for them a dirty work in Yemen, in Libya, and everywhere. Today, as we speak, you know, the Arab states, together with the Western world, what they are doing right now is what they call forming proxy forces who are answerable to the Arab states or European states. And that's exactly what they did in Sudan. Those mercenaries right now, they're destroying the Sudan. And Sudan, we knew just 1 year ago or 2 years ago, is gone. It's beyond repairable now. The country is almost collapsing. And one thing I can tell you for free, if Sudan collapsed, it will affect the neighboring states, such as Ethiopia is a fragile state. It will affect. Ethiopia will collapse. It will affect also the Chad, which is also a neighbor. The people, most of the mercenaries, they came from the other side of the Chad. If Sudan collapsed today, Chad will also collapse. So Sudan will collapse. Egypt will collapse. So that's exactly what's going on in Sudan as we speak right now. African Union, which is the body of African states, unfortunately, they failed to intervene in the Sudanese crisis for two reasons. Reason number one, what is going on today in Sudan is a proxy war. That's why the king of Saudi Arabia is going to mediate between the two journalists, rather than the role of African Union was to mediate them, because African solution for African problems, that spirit no longer exists anymore. Africa is under occupation as we speak right now. The new colonial imperialism is alive and well, and they affect their remote controlling the African societies and everywhere. The issue of let me also explain the issue of the Libya. Let me take you back again to the history. During the Colonel Gaddafi, Libya was a prosperous nation. Electricity was free. Education was free. Infrastructure was perfect. Economy was booming. Even the students, if they want to study outside the country, the government will pay and assist them so that they at least, government will pay the entire fees of the student. From primary school to the university, education was free. Healthcare was free. People are just getting and earning what they call welfare. If you are not working, if you are graduate and you don't get a job, they will give you a salary until you get the job. Until you get the job. At every sense, Libya was a prosperous nation. You cannot even compare some countries in Europe. They are much better than Europe at that time. Unfortunately, what happened? The imperialists, the Western world, they have purposely destroyed Libya beyond control. The Libya we knew just 10 years ago is gone. African nations, they are falling one after the other. This is what you call, it's not by default, it's by design. By design. Those, Western world, they are purposely destroying African nations one after the other. Let's also briefly visit Somalia. Somalia is gone. Technically, Somalia doesn't exist. It's only what we have seen is only a seat at the United Nations and flag. They balkanized Somali society into many states. Somalia enjoys one of the longest coastal areas in Africa. The NATO, the Western world, as we speak right now, the Somali coast, there is illegal fishing. They are damming waste product, nuclear product, hospital product. Nobody cannot ask them. Somalia is almost gone. There is a lot of proxy forces. There's American proxy forces. There is a United Arab Emirates proxy forces. And everyone is now just training their own forces to do their own dirty work. Let's go back to Congo, DRC Congo. DRC Congo, as we speak right now, 186 companies are mining. 186 illegal mining. They form their own forces, proxy forces. They are, in fact, arming, and they are causing a problem among the African societies. So the Africa, our future is very uncertain. And Africa, as a continent, one of the richest continents in the world, unfortunately, the interference of the Western world, it's beyond your imagination, beyond your imagination. That's why the countries in Africa, they are destroying one after the other. Unless Africa come together, discuss the issue, discuss the trade among themselves, discuss how can we move forward Africa where we are right now. And I don't think so Africa will prosper. I don't think so. The future of Africa the future of African continent is very uncertain. There is a new scramble for Africa. Chinese are there, Russians are there, Americans are there, Europeans are there, even Turkish are there. Everybody was there to loot Africa, left, right, and center. They came here to loot. Go to Africa, Central African Republic. They are not better than Somalia.
Dr. Abdisamad, you have to wrap up.
Let me conclude this way. Let me conclude, in fact. If you go to Central African Republic as we speak right now, Western world, they are mining. They are fact, it's a kind of the failed state. They are going to fail the government, African government, so that they can easily exploit their own resources. And that's exactly what's going on as we speak right now in Central African Republic. Unless African diaspora and African society come together and address the problem of the continent, then Africa is not free. Africa is not free. That's what I'm going to conclude.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abdiwahab Abdisamad. Just to continue reminding folks that you can add your questions to the Q&A box once again on the bottom left. And now we have our last speaker. His name is Essam Elkorghli. He is a Libyan doctoral student at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He taught high school economics and psychology in Minnesota. He researches contemporary imperialism and how NATO-led regime change in Libya resulted in foreign actors such as the EU, CIA, NED, Turkish Cultural Associations, et cetera, to influence various institutions in the country, particularly the ideological impact these imperial interests have on Libyan society. He is also a labor organizer with the Graduate Workers Union at the University of Illinois. So thank you so much, Essam, for being here. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Usually when I give these talks, some people say my audio is not loud enough. Can you hear me well? Okay, awesome. Thank you. So greetings, friends and comrades. Thank you, Black Alliance for Peace, for organizing this webinar. Though this date is important to us as Africans, I want to echo what the former speakers, Brother Abayomi and Brother Abdiwahab, and what they said in terms of how we should be cognizant of the impact of contemporary imperialism on the African continent. In my brief, 10, 15 minutes of, ideas that I'll be throwing today, I want to speak briefly about Libya's modern history and how it's entangled with imperialism, so we have more clarity on how this term functions, as opposed to how lots of the liberals and liberal Western media, they frame this term as either as an outdated term related to outright colonialism, or something related to one country invading another country or having cross-border skirmishes. And so this is hopefully will just add some clarity to how pressing it is that we should center our imperialism when we discuss national sovereignty, unity, and so forth. So Libya, I want to start by saying, is an African country. It's not, as some people call it, North Africa in terms of geography, or some people like to divide Africa north and south by saying sub-Sahara, which is a very racially fueled term that tries to balkanize the African continent even further. And essentially everything that's quote unquote sub-Sahara is Black, and then everything that's north is light-skinned Africans. Libya is diverse in terms of its racial formation and so forth. And this was also played in 2011 when NATO intervened, that the regime was using mercenaries, and that anybody who's Black is African, and anybody who isn't, is some sort of a superior or something like that. So I'll be speaking a little bit about Libya in that sense, how its relationship should not be the state itself should not be seen as isolated from global happenings. It has been attacked constantly by imperialism, and I'll be speaking about the tools of imperialism. So Libya, being in a North African country, has, like many of African countries, many resources that were nationalized after 1969 with the Revolutionary Command Council when they took power, such that the oil in 1971 was nationalized, and also sovereignty in terms of water aquifers in Libya were used to provide water to across all of Libya for free, or even like very little money. So, and given the fact that Libya experienced a genocide by the Italians, our small population, and the massive oil wealth from the 1970s and 80s, allowed the revolutionary leadership of the country to invest in something beyond the national developmental project, which is national and global liberation movements. So Libya was using its surplus capital in funding South African liberation movement in Northern Ireland and Palestine. The Palestinian cause was very central to the Libyan state, and also across Latin America and Nicaragua and many other places. As Libya was trying to fund and support these liberation movements, and we call them liberation movements because they are interested in national sovereignty, as opposed to certain leaders when they frame themselves as, just tied to international liberal order. And so Libya faced crippling sanctions. And sanctions, the way that they work is really predicated on US hegemony. US hegemony in terms of finance capital. If you think of it like this, I know some of you and Black Alliance for Peace have worked with the International Tribunal on US sanctions, and you have heard probably in the hearing about how imperialism works, and many of the hearings, be it Eritrea, be it Libya, and 2 days from now is going to be on Haiti. Sanctions, the way that they work, they really prevent a state from conducting its own national development project by creating a hardship on the population. It targets the population, not the leadership of the country, in order to create dissatisfaction and, as a result, regime change. The sanctions on Libya starting from early 70s until 2003, they targeted the healthcare section, so civilian section, aviation, and also education. The healthcare section, it made it impossible to import certain drugs let's say I want to actually even buy something, let's say from a European country, it has to be transacted with US dollar, which goes through from Libya to the US through some sort of codes, Wall Street, and goes to a European country. Because of the sanctions, we were barred from importing medicine. The same thing with planes and spare parts and maintenance. We had even accidents in Libya that killed civilians because of these sanctions. In education, book production, we had to, because we could not do maintenance and get spare parts for the equipment, that also made it impossible for us to produce enough textbooks during that period. And students were barred from studying abroad in certain countries that were allies to the United States, because Libya was framed as such to be terrorist state, and Libya is trying to expand globally. And so this isolation led Libya to align itself more with genuinely Pan-African countries, and led to the establishment of the African Union, which is an extension from the African organization, AOU, African Organization of Unity. So in 1999, 9th of September, African Union was established. The sanctions, as they were lifted, most of the West thought that Libya will be aligned with the international liberal order, and that Libya has no chemical weapons, that it's a peaceful country that really the West viewed potentially as a new ally in the region. However, that wasn't necessarily the case, because despite the fact that sanctions were lifted on Libya, Libya was invested in national sovereign project that's not, again, predicated on neoliberalism, privatization of everything on land and the air and the sea. It was still maintaining its, as Brother Abdiwahab mentioned, its socialist project of free healthcare, free education, public housing, and endless social services. And so with that amount of wealth that Libya had, it wanted to invest in Africa. So it had numerous projects across the continent that were based on, be it an agricultural sector or tourism and so forth. But what's really interesting is that when Libya wanted to conduct a massive project like a railroad or something like that, it invited all parts of the global economy, be it France or US, China, and Russia, and they had a bidding for construction of railroad in Libya, which they wanted to call the Africa Gate, which was bombed by NATO in 2011. And so as they had these companies bid on which contract is the best, Libya chose China and Russia to construct this railroad. A couple of days after that, US Embassy cable leak in 2008 reads the following: the fact that an operator with Bechtel's savvy and deep pockets was ultimately unable to secure its contract serves as a cautionary tale for the many US and Western companies seeking to enter Libya's booming market. So despite the fact that Libya did not harm, just decided to carry on its own national developmental project with its own interest and South-South solidarity, they saw it as a threat. So this is where I think the term imperialism is very, very important to understand how it's imbibed in international relations. It's not a populist slogan, mentioned like uttered by global South leaders. It's first and foremost a financial term that explains how the relationship of dependency. And what I mean by the dependency is that you have the periphery exporting raw materials to be transformed by overly priced higher consumer goods by the core, where the surplus value or the profit is usually, if not always, usurped by the core. And imperialism is this forced integration of the periphery with the core by all means necessary, including military. And so in Libya, when it decided to carry on its own developmental project after the sanctions were lifted, away from this imperialist order, they saw it as a threat. Hence, the 2011 events that really destroyed Libya and brought it on its knees and destroyed the country and froze its assets and so forth. So lest we forget, we have Julian Assange and his scintillating work with WikiLeaks that really exposed the bloodthirsty NATO and Hillary Clinton, well, both Clintons, they're both bloodthirsty, to overthrow the Libyan state, to stifle its Pan-African project. So her emails of 2011, they say that they wanted to bomb Libya and do the regime change because, quote, Gaddafi's government holds 143 tons of gold intended to be used to establish a Pan-African currency to provide the Francophone African countries with an alternative to the French franc, which is something that Brother Abdiwahab also mentioned. This was one of the factors that influenced President at the time, Nicolas Sarkozy's decision to commit France to the attack on Libya. And so Sarkozy's plans are driven by the following issues. So she mentions five bullet points, and 4 of them are completely, achieved perfectly, because the foreign policy of the United States is not sporadic, it's not random. They study things very well. They're smart and they know how they should carry out their, destruction of states. And yes, sometimes I found a lot of people on the left, they really joke, they say, oh, this is so stupid, or this is, they undermine how, adroit they are in the use of their tools, but they really have foresight, and we shouldn't undermine the complexity of their work. And so this is what she further writes. She says that France is interested in Libya because of the desire to gain a greater share of Libya oil production, which has happened, increase French influence in North Africa, happened, provide French military with an opportunity to reassert his position in the world, and then address the concern of his advisors over Gaddafi's long-term plans to supplant France as dominant power in the Francophone Africa. So how can we understand these words of 2011 when we look at Libya vis-a-vis Africa in our contemporary day? So sanctions on Libya since 2011, they haven't been lifted. So despite the fact that they said that we're going to sanction Gaddafi and his regime because he was allegedly killing his own people, right? Now that the regime is changed, everything's complete, the sanctions still there. Libya's assets in Africa are being nationalized or sold for the price of breadcrumbs. And what's ironic is that most of the countries that are buying those assets are UAE, Turkey, and endless European countries, especially Western European. And then we see also NATO began to expand southwards. In their summit in Madrid in 2022, they said that North Africa right now is becoming their southern neighborhood, similar to the Monroe Doctrine of the imperialist United States, how they describe Latin America, that this is our neighborhood. We can do and conduct our own activities as we wish because we live there with you. I wish if they said with you, because that insinuates conviviality and camaraderie, but it's not. And then since 2011, AFRICOM began operating now in nearly 50 countries on different scales. And so wherever NATO and AFRICOM operate, extremists seem to multiply, leading to further militarization. And AFRICOM is not a neutral power. It's expanding in Africa to stifle any alternative. Alex Saab, who is a Colombian national and works as an advisor for the Venezuelan government, his plane from South Africa was flying to Iran, to Venezuela to deliver aid because of the sanctions. His plane, as it was flying over Africa, African Air, was downed by AFRICOM in Cape Verde and extradited to the United States. And also Cape Verde was subjugated to a threat of sanctions if they didn't conduct this extradition, despite the fact that they have no agreement between the two. Is this an isolated event? Unfortunately not, because on the 11th of December 2022, something happened to Libya as well. Masoud Bouajela, who used to be a security person during the previous regime before 2011, was kidnapped from his home in Tripoli, Libya, by local militias, who are functionaries of US imperialism, and handed to the US in the city of Misrata, 200 kilometers east of Tripoli, where many NATO troops, Turkish, Italian, British, and American, are operating furtively. We need to remember that Turkey is part of NATO. Something very important that I think for some people they omit that. And then the Libyan state destruction, contemporary destruction, is felt across the African continent through the handing of 27 million pieces of weapons to the rebels in 2011. The weapons trickled down, they were sold on black market, and now those weapons exist in Mali and Chad and Niger, and has led also to the destabilization of Sudan. And the events in Sudan are also tied with what's happened in Libya. Lest we forget, again, 2011, that the president of Sudan, Bashir at the time, was on the International Criminal Court list. NATO and the Africa Command, saw no issue with giving weapons to al-Bashir for him to smuggle through the Sudanese-Libyan border for it to reach the rebels who were fighting to overthrow the Libyan regime at the time. As NATO armed the Libyan rebels, they also flew a Libyan exiled military man whose name is Khalifa Haftar. This CIA asset in Libya is now in charge of the Libyan army. When he wanted to attack Tripoli and take over in 2019, this rapid support force of Sudan funded by the functionary of Imperialism, United Arab Emirates, sent weapons and soldiers to aid Haftar to take over Tripoli. His plans failed because Italy and Turkey had alternative interests in the country, and they supported the sitting government in Tripoli. Now, Mr. Haftar is paying back the services to the RSF, the Rapid Support Force in Sudan, as they are fighting the Sudanese army. This isn't. Yeah.
Excuse me, Essam, as you wind up, speak a little more slowly so the interpreter can speak up.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
And so this is what's happening in Eastern Libya. Just today in Western Libya, the government of national unity, which was parachuted by the United Nations. Libya does not have democracy since it was bombed by NATO. Just bombed civilians in the city of Zawiya, and this was done by drones handed to Libyan state by Turkey. The same Birgdar that we saw functioning in Ukraine, they also were handed to the Libyan state. So Libya has been militarily integrated with the European Union, with NATO, also in terms of how to protect, quote unquote, or manage the influx of migrants, such that the city of Zawiya, this particular city, houses two large militias that are on sanctions list, but they still receive funding from European Union's Frontex operation, which is an operation to make sure that trafficking of humans and smuggling and migration does not reach Europe, or at least control it. So the idea of surplus labor or an army reserve of labor, they get to control it by outsourcing this act, this inhumane act of keeping people from fleeing conflict zones and forcing them to stay in a racist conditions in Libya, is being funded by the European Union. So and so Libya is a destroyed country. Sanctions still ongoing. The Libya's army in Western Libya is integrated with the European Union. There is a security dependency. We depend on them in terms of intelligence. National sovereignty does not exist anymore. So this is what imperialism is. Is this something new? No. Imperialism, in my view, is alive and well, and we have to learn from the past and the ancestors who blessed us with endless lessons on how to fight and imagine an alternative future. And I'll end with a quote from one of the most famous Pan-Africanists, Thomas Sankara, who said on the necessity of change. And he says, "You cannot carry out fundamental change without a certain amount of madness. In this case, it comes from nonconformity, the courage to turn your back on the old formulas, the courage to invent the future. It took the madmen of yesterday for us to be able to act with extreme clarity today. I want to be one of those madmen. We must dare to invent the future." Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Essam. That was a really great way to kick off our Q&A. We have a few questions in queue, but if you have any additional questions, please put it in the chat, but we're about to get started. So if all of our speakers can...
You don't mean the Q&A, right?
Sorry?
You don't mean put the questions in the chat, you mean put them in the Q&A.
Oh, correct. Yes, sorry. Yeah, so if all of the speakers can open their, turn on their video so that we can, I can direct questions to folks. All right. Okay, so the first, thank you. The first question is, what is the state of the African Union? And was the breakup of, and this breakup of Sudan, if someone could break that down a little bit, could that have been avoided? Who was to blame for that secession and the chaos that has plagued it? And there was another question around Ethiopia and whether or not, Ethiopia will be able to avoid something similar with Tigray, and if anyone has an update on the state of that ceasefire as well. Who would like to kind of take a stab at that question first?
Well, I'll take a first response. Could the partition of Sudan been avoided? We have to look at the history of the country. Even under British imperialism, they utilized the system of governance, which systematically divided the north from the south of the country. for decades. That had a lot to do with the eruption of the first Civil War, which started at the conclusion of 1955 on the eve of the national independence of the Republic of Sudan, where the military officers who had worked under the British system mutinied. And the Civil War lasted for 17 years, up until 1972. And then, of course, there was a ceasefire. 11 years later, in 1983, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement and Army opened up fronts in the south of the country under the leadership of Jafar al-Numeri, who eventually became a close ally of the United States. So there's already a history of this division imposed by British imperialism, but continued by the neo-colonial system. Of course, the Civil War was very devastating between 1983 and a ceasefire was agreed upon around 2005. And the president at the time, Omar al-Bashir, agreed through negotiations to recognize a referendum conducted by the UN in South Sudan, which, of course, most people voted in favor of secession. And Omar al-Bashir agreed to recognize the referendum, and the country was granted independence and was recognized by the United Nations and the African Union. So, yeah, it's a very complicated history. And today, obviously it didn't resolve the internal crisis in Sudan, because today we have the conflict between the two dominant military structures, which in many ways have brought these contradictions to the center of Sudan. Khartoum is the major focal point of the conflict today.
Thank you for that. Is there anyone else that wants to add to that? I think Mr. Abayomi made a really great point. Okay. Well, we have another question for you, Dr. Azikiwe. Could you give more background on the two forces in Sudan? Is one more progressive than the other? And again, it's kind of complicated.
Well, I'm not there, and I have to follow, a lot of the statements that have been made by the resistance committees, which have been in the vanguard of the democratic movement over the last 4.5 years. They do not see any fundamental political differences between the rapid support forces and the Sudanese armed forces. And if we look back to 2019, when Omar al-Bashir was removed as a result of the mass struggle, nonetheless, it was not the people physically who removed him. It was other people inside the military. And immediately in 2019, we had a huge influx of capital from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. We had the intervention of the United States, which has been trying to impose a political agreement on Sudan. There's been efforts by the African Union states, which have failed, unfortunately. And even the negotiations that we see now, the South Sudan wanted to hold talks in Juba. And they never occurred. The only forces that could bring together the two belligerents were the US and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So that should tell you a lot right there in terms of the political character of both the SAF and the RSF. Other people may have other views on that issue.
Oh, Dr. Abdiwahab, did you have a comment real quick? Oh, you're muted.
Let me add a few things to what our brother has said already. You have to understand the internal dynamics of the Sudan. When the military take over the power, they have to transfer the power into civilian. That's exactly what's the arrangements. Unfortunately, the imperialists, the Western world, they realize that if today's election is being called, then the Islamists will win in landslide. So that they are going to delay the entire process of handing over the power into civilian. And that happened exactly in Sudan. The other issue I'm going to rectify is, it was an agreement between the rapid response forces of the Habiti and the Sudanese military junta. They have to integrate those forces of Hamiti into the military within 2 years. But those proxy forces, they refuse to do that. They ask for 10 years, which means that what they call a delaying tactic. But the military were, in fact, they were ready to hand over the power into elected civilians. And they were ready, in fact, to conduct a free and fair election. But the reality on the ground, if election is being called today, the Islamists will win in the landslide. And the reality is that. That's why they called, impose the former Prime Minister Hamdoun into power so that they can, prepare the ground. Sudan, the way I have seen right now, Sudan, they are going to balkanize. Balkanization of the Sudan has already begun. I don't know whether they're going Darfurians to become, independent state, or they are going to also, Kordofan to be part of also independent state. But basically what I'm saying is the balkanization of Sudan already started. And that's what they want to do the rest of Africa. Somalia has been balkanized, Libya has been balkanized, Sudan has been balkanized. That's what they want to see. Let me add a few things what Essam has said just a short while ago. Muammar al-Gaddafi, in fact, he was willing to establish what they call a gold currency in Africa. He assisted most of the liberation movement in Africa. No question about that. He was an Africanist, he was a Pan-Africanist. In fact, he was willing to unite an African continent, at least to realize the dreams of our fathers, like Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Ahmed Sekaturi, Jamal Abdel Nasser, and those guys. But who is going to listen to them? In fact, one of the issues they destroyed in Libya is, Libya, during the Gaddafi time, literacy rate was very high. People were living, they were not surviving, they were not surviving anymore. Libya was much better than most of the European countries. And unfortunately, they purposely destroyed Libya, and they are going to destroy the rest of Africa. That's what I'm going to add.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Abdiwahab. So Essam, where can we find the Clinton documents you mentioned, and do you have any other examples that show the US's foresight and planning to control either Libya or just the continent as a whole?
So the WikiLeaks one, I just typed it as a response to the person who posed the question. So I have it stored in one of my tabs. So and WikiLeaks has endless resources that really expose how the US is planning to do certain things in the future, be it a decade ago or 20 years ago or so forth. I think one way to find how the US is planning to do things is how they speak about the world. So I give you an example. Right now, the United States, Biden-Harris administration, they said that they want to continue to offset any Russia-China influences in Africa, and by granting $8.9 billion to the US aid to do various projects. And they say this in democracy promotion, freedom of speech, and also independent journalism. You look at the training program, and all of this is public. So if you're interested in seeing how media works, look at media. If you're interested in textbooks, like the CIA is writing Libya's civic education textbooks. And this is all public information. It just needs somebody to kind of see the lines of, the connections between National Endowment of Democracy and the CIA and so forth. In Africa right now, they're doing this independent journalism, funding for for a lot of African countries, especially in East and Southeast Africa, to expose, quote unquote, malign Chinese influences. And then also there's the Gregory Meeks, the act that was just passed in Congress earlier, the end of last summer, the Countering of Malign Russian Activities in Africa Act. And all of this is public information that you can see how the United States is trying to maintain its unipolar world order. And all this is public. So obviously I cannot tell you what's happening in the Pentagon and CIA and so forth, but you can really map the ideology behind these documents as they exist on the World Wide Web.
Great, thank you. That was a really helpful way to paint that picture of how we can find more information. That kind of moves on to the next question. So someone asked about level of consciousness within the countries of Libya and Sudan, specifically the level of consciousness as it relates to the imperialists' intentional role in the destruction of their countries. I know that, I think it was Dr. Abdiwahab had briefly mentioned that generally, folks folks were aware that, the imperialism is, the primary contradiction on the continent, but can anyone really speak to the level of consciousness now in Libya and Sudan as it relates to imperialism's role?
Well, it was interesting that the resistance committees and some elements of the Forces for Freedom and Change refused to participate in the process, the trilateral mechanism that was put together by some countries on the African continent along with the United Nations with the military. Some of the democratic forces refuse to negotiate with the military because they do not trust the military, and they believe that the military in Sudan is subsidized and supported and takes political direction from the imperialist countries and their allies, for example, in the Gulf Arab monarchies. In terms of Libya, I am sure that since 2011, it is very difficult for anybody in any position of authority to speak against imperialism or to speak in favor, of the previous revolutionary government due to repression. But both countries have produced theoretical works and have contributed, to the struggle against imperialism. But at the same time, we're looking at the continued dominance of imperialism in Africa. And as other panelists have pointed out, you have all types of legislation that is in Congress, whether it's been passed or not passed. We have the State Department, we have the Central Intelligence Agency, AFRICOM, monitoring very closely all political developments and political tendencies in Libya as well as Sudan and in other African countries. And their objective is to destabilize those states and to also prevent any anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, or anyone promoting African unity that contradicts the foreign policy imperatives of the Western imperialist countries.
If I may add to that, part of the imperialist onslaught on Libya was to obviously fund these Muslim Brotherhood leaning factions who are very reactionary and pro-comprador, pro-imperialism in many ways. And we see what they have done to Libya is really exemplifies how imperialism works. The first thing that they did once they took charge is to ban books. Books that were produced for the 40 years in Libya were either canceled, burned, and also NATO in 2011 bombed a compound that was a civilian compound filled with just books produced by Libyan intellectuals that really speak about delinking from the imperialist order, creating a national sovereignty project and so forth, was bombed. But then also they play with the national memory of the Libyan people. They changed street names. We had a street name, I know, quoted Sankara earlier, but we had a Sankara street. Now it's changed to some Turkish name. because Libya's relationship with Turkey right now is good. We had Jamal Abdel Nasser's statue in Benghazi, and then Jamal Abdel Nasser Street next to it. They were all changed to Independence Street, and they bombed and destroyed that statue. And so imperialism is also first and foremost ideological project. How could you make people agree that imperialism is good? That our position in the world, that we are the underclass and we should be servicing global capitalism. And the only way to do that is by following their model of development. So that's kind of how in the textbooks I know study education, they don't mention anything about Libya's revolutionary role in the 1973 war against the Zionists. They don't speak about a role in global politics. None of that. Our history, national history, stops in 1969. And this is intentional scotoma towards history to kind of make Libyans forget about their country's feisty history and make them feel like they're part of this global liberal order without any contentiousness with the West. So I'll just stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Abayomi and Essam. That was really great in helping to provide some context in how destructive imperialism is particularly ideologically. So we're going to do one last question. Unfortunately, I know there are a lot of questions in the chat, and I'll also explain how to find our speakers online, maybe follow up with these questions. The last question is, can the speakers maybe talk a bit more about the question of normalization with Israel in Africa and the role of Israel in Sudan, Libya, also maybe how we can understand the role of Russia and China in Africa, particularly within these two states in question. And please try to keep your responses to about 2 minutes each.
Well, in regard to the recognition of the state of Israel, the so-called Abraham Accords are an imperialist initiative to undermine solidarity with the Palestinians. And that's why it created a problem in Sudan, because as early as 1958, the Sudanese parliament passed an Israeli Boycott Act, which prohibits the country from trading with the state of Israel. Trump forced Abdallah Hamdok to agree to this purported normalization of relations with Tel Aviv. And just recently at the African Union meeting that took place, an Israeli ambassador was ejected from the conference because the whole question of them being observers to the AU was challenged by several states, particularly those in Southern Africa, as well as Algeria. So yes, and China and Russia, of course, are escalating their cooperation with AU member states. And this is the rationale behind the bills that are in the US Congress now, the propaganda against the People's Republic of China and Russia to turn Africans on the continent and in the diaspora against both Russia and China in favor of the United States.
In terms, Abdiwahab, would you like to add?
Yes, I'm going to add a few things. You know, there's a new scramble for Africa as we speak right now. The Western world, they are against what they call the China presence in Africa. And Chinese also, they are going to dominate in terms of trade in Africa. Russian also, in Turkey also, they're interested in Africa. And to be honest, there's a new scramble for Africa as we speak right now. And that's why if you look at the Sudan issues right now, there's a lot of conflict of interest among those nations. And everybody is going to take his own portion of the resource of Africa. They're going to loot African society. Nothing short of that. Why the powers are so interested in Africa today? They want to loot cheap material and raw material and the cheap labor and so on and so forth. So Africa now became a battleground for superpowers. What we have seen for the last 5 years and so, it's kind of the proxy war between the superpowers. Unfortunately, it's difficult African Union to resolve the Sudanese crisis until they address those powers who are in fact behind this kind of the proxy wars, unless they address the what you call the Gulf factor, American factor, and Russian factor, and Chinese factor. It's difficult to solve, the Sudanese crisis. Africa, it is right now as we speak, the African Union became a toothless. They can't resolve anything. They really dismantled African Union. Literally, they dismantled it. That's why the notion of free African solution for African problem is gone, is dead.
May I just add one thing about the Zionist entity? I never call it by its name because I don't recognize it as a state, and I think we as Pan-Africanists should understand the weight of history. What they have done to South Africa when South Africa was under apartheid, the Zionists, they supported the apartheid regime. Now that South Africa is liberated, they are the most outspoken, country in Africa speaking against the Zionists, and we should stand with South Africa because they know the weight of the apartheid. Palestinians are experiencing apartheid, but this wave of normalization that's, wave is maybe exaggeration, is largely driven by, yes, the Abraham Accords in the Northern African region, but there's also people forgetting that Israel as a so-called state is, infiltrating in a lot of the conflicts. In Yemen, they are colonizing with the UAE, Socotra, the small island, which is between Yemen and Sudan. In Nigeria, they are aiding what they call decolonizing Nigeria, and by supporting the Biafra, liberation movement, and they want to balkanize Nigeria even further. And so the Zionists, their project is to still the same as the United States, just a different, same face, different face of the same coin, essentially balkanizing the African states. They say that we're a third world country as well. We're from the global south, and we're trying to do observe and try to integrate with you and collaborate with you. But we as Pan-Africans should stand against that in terms of how they treat our brothers in Palestine. And in terms of China, I just want to speak one brief thing. We should be very critical, very, very critical of what the Western media says about China. This China debt trap has not it doesn't exist. That hasn't been proven that they have accumulated by dispossession, by giving loans, and then they take if a country cannot pay the loans. And Russia, what did it do 2 months ago? They literally canceled the debt that was equivalent of $20 billion. When did the IMF or the World Bank or the United States or NATO or EU do anything like that before? They are projecting their malign activities in the African continent. Malign, by they, I mean the EU and the US, because they have accumulated and dispossessed Africans from their land and resources for so many years. They think that just because another country is coming into Africa, they're doing the same thing. Please, if maybe I might be ignorant or biased, but please provide me sources that show that there's accumulation by dispossession by China or Russia happening on the African continent. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. All three speakers were incredible and provided amazing insight. Thank you so much, Mr. Abayomi, Essam, and Dr. Abdiwahab. This was incredible. And if you would like to catch this up, find this recording, it is going to be on Facebook. And please, if you are interested in, continuing to be involved and follow all of these people's work, please check out our Twitter at Blacks for Peace, and you will find their Twitter ads as well on our page. And again, if you're interested in learning more about BAP and being involved in the work and supporting BAP's work, please go to blackallianceforpeace.com, and you can be able to find all of the information and join, hopefully. So thank you again so much. Please join the U.S. Out of Africa Network as well. And we're concluding the webinar on imperialism in Sudan and Libya. Thank you, everyone.